Wrapping up here, our final 10, 15 minutes or so on Take Command. I don't know how much longer it's going to be, Logan, because we haven't done this yet. That's how time works.
Exciting.
We don't know. We're not on a clock. We're not in overtime. We're in the fourth quarter. I guess we kind of are in overtime in a way. We don't know how much time is left. By the way, speaking of the rules thing, that was a question I did have. I knew the new rules, but as that we got near the end of the first overtime, I did not know in whether or not it was like that was the end of the first quarter or like, hey, does Kansas City need to score before time expired?
What I thought. Yeah, I was like, did they need to score a touchdown right here? Like, what's happening?
Do they need to get going? Like, what's going on?
It was really weird to watch, yeah.
Yeah, so luckily Gene Steratore on the broadcast did say, like, no, this is the first quarter. Because otherwise I guess you would have had a 2-minute warning. So that makes sense as well. But there you go. We all learned something, even if some of us learned more than others. Okay, Commanders have made a couple of hires since we last met, including one this morning, Bobby Johnson. Now the offensive line coach for Kliff Kingsbury and Dan Quinn. Last couple of years, he's been the Giants O-line coach. I don't think the job he did in New York is why he's getting this job, because it has not been a pretty couple of years for the Giants offensive line. But he's had some other good results, good stops, and I think there's also a tape study to be done here that I know we haven't had the chance to do yet, where we go, okay, is this well designed and poorly executed, or do we have real questions about the hire that just got made?
Yeah, and I will say this though, like to Bobby's maybe credit, and I've got to watch more film, obviously, of what's happening here. But just thinking back, like they do a good job of like marrying run and pass concepts together from a formation standpoint. That's the offensive line coach. Obviously, they're coaching technical elements, but there's a huge tactical element to that job in terms of what runs do we like, what are our best protections. And I think from a run game standpoint, you see some good stuff. You see guys that are well coached. Obviously, Saquon Barkley has had some explosive runs over his time in New York that we're very familiar with here in Washington. So I just want to point that out. Like I know that hire seems like, oh no, that's tough. Like what's happening? But there are more layers to what that position does. And I also want to say like he's had a front row seat to see how to insulate an offensive line. I think New York, because they have a bad one, does a really good job of like calling plays, designing a game plan around insulating that group. So I think having that level of experience could potentially be very helpful. But again, so don't look at this as like on the surface and go like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. There are many layers to this position, and hopefully like he's really good at these other elements, and hopefully like maybe he just didn't have the right group of 5 guys up there in New York, and this is the right one for him. So
yeah, and so we'll do some more tape study and dive into this deeper probably next week. But I will also say, like on the resume, even these last couple of years, like Andrew Thomas was a second-team All-Pro 2 years ago. So like young player development got a pretty good notch in his belt on that one. So we'll see. I think to me the bigger concern, and again, this is a concern. This is not a death sentence. This is me expressing out loud
just
thoughts.
Being honest, man. Being honest, right? We're just talking through some stuff.
We're just talking. Just a couple of guys talking.
The sky's not falling yet. We're just talking stuff.
No, it's February. The sky can't fall. Not at least until September. But I think that the concern that I have is exactly mirrored in excitement on the other side of the ball. So on defense, Dan Quinn has hired Joe Witt. Joe Witt's hired some folks, Jason Simmons, who they've all worked together before. They come from the same school of thought. They have personal and professional familiarity, and that's exciting to me. Like, let's get not in the way that Ron Rivera did, where it's like, let's just get the gang that didn't work get back together. Like, these are guys that have worked together in successful situations. Let's get the continuity of success, right? As opposed to what happened, the ultimate bad example, I've used this a bunch of times on this show and the radio show, is like what happened in Carolina. I think Frank Reich and Thomas Brown and all those guys that got there, there's a lot of good coaches that were offensively in the room last year for Carolina. They hadn't worked together before, and they didn't work together last year. That was a bad group. Yeah. And so I see Kliff hire, keeps Tavita Pritchard. I think Tavita was pretty well reviewed, seemed to be very sought after, seems to be a good coach. Obviously, I think there's some questions about what happened last year, but how much of that was Bieniemy, how much of that was Tavita, how much of that was other people, whatever. Yeah. Tavita seems to be a good coach. I think Kliff offensively is a good coach. Bobby Johnson, O-line, but it's a bunch of guys that
got to come together.
Johnson, they got to come together, and I think that can be done. And I think there are some similarities in how these coaches have coached in some various places. But I think one of the reasons that the offense did not go as well as BNB wanted last year was a lack of cohesiveness on staff. Now, he didn't get to pick any of those guys. Kliff at least is picking these guys, but it does give it is something that has to happen. I'll put it that way.
No, I 100% agree, and I think like because it's like any kind of professional environment, right? You want to be friends or have a functioning working relationship with your coworkers, right? Like if we didn't like each other, this podcast wouldn't be very good, right? Because you wouldn't be able to talk through some stuff. And I think that's what you're looking at here. It's like you're getting guys together that I think that have good resumes in their own right, but it's like how do they come together? How do they gel? Much in the same way when you bring in players to a new locker room, like how do they gel? If you bring the wrong piece in, it doesn't work. So I think you bring up a great point about the defense. I think there's a lot to be excited about there, specifically in the back end. Like I'm really excited for the secondary. I think all of their experience, all of their kind of key data points along the resume is fantastic. But like you said, offensively, they've got some stuff that they got to talk through, they got to work through, and we won't have any kind of definitive information on that until we get later in the process. So.
Yeah, and I know you guys are talking to Kliff. Hopefully
tomorrow or Wednesday. We'll see. Yep.
Yeah, so Command Center should have a good interview. I would also recommend a couple of years ago during the pandemic. I might have mentioned this on the last show, but a couple of years ago during the pandemic, Sean McVay, I guess, was bored. So he and Peter Schrager did a podcast. And so Kliff was a guest on that podcast. And I thought there was some interesting stuff in that pod about for Kliff talking about how it was a struggle at times to find the time to be in command of the offense because you have to be the head coach first. Like you have to kind of mix and match your time. And he gets in at 4 a.m. and watches the tape, and it's the only time he can kind of get to himself. And he better be done by 7 because then he's got to get ready for the team meeting at 8. Like That's just the reality. And so now him as an OC, and it's kind of funny too, seeing some of the stuff that went around. Like even last night after Mahomes wins, there was this great list of Mahomes and his losses at Texas Tech under Kliff. And the stats are insane. Like he averaged in his losses 389 yards and 3 touchdowns.
Wow.
Average.
That's incredible. Yeah.
Average. And it's like, well, it seems to me like the defense was the problem. So maybe this Kliff only has to coach the offense thing might actually work out. But I do think, again, like the cohesiveness between Brian Johnson, Tavita Pritchard, and like making sure everyone is clear on their roles. I'm curious, like in your experience, have you been a part of staffs where there wasn't that cohesion? And then obviously, like I think most famously, that 2012 staff was very on the same page, or at least by the time the information got to you guys as a team was on the same page.
Yeah, I think, every staff that I've been a part of, especially when it's not going well, like one that sticks out to me is like Chicago, like just guys that had kind of come from different areas, different backgrounds, different coaching trees. They all had, they're all very smart guys, but they're all like, this is the way we're going to solve this problem. And that just didn't jive, just didn't lead to a productive offense. And I think, we had a young offensive coordinator at the time. Dal Logan's a guy who I think is really smart. He's now the OC for South Carolina. So good job, Dal, back in the saddle. But young guy and some older coaches underneath him that had a very strong perspective, a couple that were kind of on the way out, just kind of wrangling all those cats. I think, like you said, like you talked about the film element of being an offensive coordinator. I think there's a leadership element there too. Like this is the direction we want to go. And I think about Sean, I think about Kyle, in both San Francisco here. And then when Sean obviously was the OC, and then even when I was in Houston and like Bill O'Brien's the head coach and there's the OC, like there was a very clear vision for everybody. Right. And I think that's kind of what that offensive coordinator position needs to encapsulate. And I hopefully Kliff, because he's got the more time now, can kind of get that done and get everybody on the same page. And this is part of building the staff, right? And I think you hire these guys because you've got pre-existing relations with them and you believe in what they do. And I think ultimately, like, we'll have to see what happens. But, that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, Johnson's the one that's interesting to me, like, because if you're keeping Pritchard, Johnson was a QB coach, then he was an OC in Philly, and he's got so much experience coaching quarterbacks. Like he was with Dak. Obviously, he's been with Jalen. He's known Jalen since Jalen was 6 years old.
Oh, wow.
Because Brian, when he was a high school player, was coached by Jalen's dad before going to Utah and having a pretty good career as a player there. So, like, what is his role? Like, what is his position? Like, what is his versus what is Tavita's? Obviously, Kliff is a former quarterback. Like, how involved is he there and whoever this young guy is? And just as long as there aren't too many cooks in the kitchen, I think it can work. One thing that I do appreciate is this seems to be a pretty young staff. Maybe Bobby Johnson's definitely a little bit older than the rest of these guys. He's been coaching for 14 years. He's the O-line coach, but That is something that I have seen before. When Kevin was the OC and Bill Callahan was on staff, like they butted heads because Bill thought he knew better at all times, and at times he may have been right.
Right.
But Kevin was ultimately the OC, and obviously Jay was the head coach, and then all of a sudden Bill was the head coach in that final year in 2019, and that was not always pretty all the time. So that is a dynamic both in professional, one thing I like about Brian Johnson coming with Kliff is like Brian's played in a lot of he's a guy that uses a lot of spread stuff.
Yeah.
So similar personnel groupings, but maybe some different ideas of how to deploy them. Like that could be really exciting.
Yeah.
But how do they get along like personally, professionally, if you will? Not do they go hang out and have dinner, but like how do they interact as human beings in the building? How do they respect each other? How is that information and those relationships presented to the players? And that's the same as in any corporate structure, but that stuff becomes obviously really important. And I think on the defensive side, because the familiarity, you're not going to have to worry about any of that stuff.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think the other thing, you mentioned like who gets what responsibilities when it comes to Tavita, Ben Johnson, and
Brian Johnson,
excuse me, and then Kliff. I think, one thing that you're seeing more and more with offensive staffs is you're seeing a run game coordinator and you're seeing a pass game coordinator. And that's just because, and I think you bring in that guy like Brian Johnson because he's got that ability to do that for you, right? And it just helps streamline the process a little bit. Kyle had a run game coordinator a long time for San Fran. I think Sean had a pass game guy. I think it might have been O'Connell when he was there. It's a valuable tool. So just getting guys who know offense, who've got that background, is extremely important. And I think, we'll see how it all settles in, like you said, but I don't think it's not a reason to be alarmed that there's these guys with kind of similar skill sets. Cause I think as long as you give them clearly defined roles and give them responsibilities, I think you want guys that are smart, that see things see things in a similar way and can come to easy solutions.
No doubt. All right. So I would say the Thursday show. I think it'll be the Thursday show, later in the week show, whatever show's the next one. We will reflect. Logan, maybe give us some insight on the interviews with Kliff and Joe Witt, assuming that you guys get those guys on Command Center, get a chance to talk to them. But I do think the bulk of that episode will be a mock draft. We promise you mock draft 1.0. So Take Command mock draft 1.0. Let's see where we are before we head into the combine in a couple of weeks. So plenty of draft coverage between now and the end of, the end of draft season, the draft. Also, free agency primer needs to happen soon because free agency at this point is now like 3 weeks away, which is nuts. If you like this episode and you're not subscribed yet, do that. Subscribe wherever it is you're watching or listening right now, and we will see you later in the week for a mock draft. Yep, it's time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.